Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Sargent. Welcome to my course, 101 Most Misunderstood Verses. We're coming to you today from Sacred Fire Church in Bellevue, Florida. Come on by. All right, so histories choose to include, exclude, and arrange data. You're going to write a history. What are you going to talk about? What aren't you going to talk about? What matters, what doesn't matter? Usually the historian has an angle, a perspective, some even very vague impression that they have about the nature of events and what caused these events to happen. And so they're going to choose some things, not talk about other things, and they're going to arrange their material in such a way to teach about the cause-effect structures that they believe was at work in a historical event. The prophet's going to do the same thing. Talk about some things, not talk about other things. So you read the book of Chronicles, and how different is it from 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel and Kings? Chronicles does not talk about the northern kingdom. Kings does. Chronicles is interested in the house of Judah. Chronicles is interested in the worship of Israel, in the temple structures. And because he's interested in those things, he tends to not talk about the sins of all of the kings that he mentions, but tends to talk about the things they did, good or bad, in terms of right worship with the temple. The writer of Chronicles has a different agenda, a different thing he wants to talk about. So even though Chronicles borrows a good portion of history from Kings, takes some things verbatim out of it, it's still a different book because he's attempting to create a different conversation, a different theology, a different interest, a different purpose. So he chooses some things and rejects others. He doesn't want to talk about Ahab. He wants to talk about Jehoshaphat. He doesn't want to talk about this guy, but he does want to talk about that guy. He spends a lot of time on David's things that were happening with David behind the scenes in the creation of the temple. David wasn't allowed to build it, but he did prepare for it. Kings doesn't talk about that. Kings not interested in that. It's not what it's right. It's not what it's about. It's not how the book is meant to be. So you get this idea. You include, you exclude, you arrange the materials. And so it's going to be very important for us to track. You don't just take a story and read the story and rip it out of the book. You have to read the story in the context of the story and see what role it plays in the larger movement of the book and the larger purposes of the book. Why is this story told? And why is it told here? And why is it told the way it's told? So, the Gospel of Mark. When you move into the second half of the book, you start moving, there's going to be one miracle in the second half of the book. But the last miracle, as you're approaching the middle of the book, is the guy that Jesus has to pray for twice. And in that narrative sermon, it's the only miracle. It starts out with them accusing Jesus of making accusations against the nature of Jesus and saying wrong things about him. Then he's on the boat with his disciples, warning them not to pay attention to what the Pharisees are saying about him. Then they have the healing of the blind man that he has to pray for twice. Then they have the conversation with Peter. Who do the people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And it ends with the great enunciation by Peter, thou art the Christ. And you have to say it in King James, because it just comes off most powerful in King James. Thou art the Christ. Right. Then, immediately after this, we enter into a transition in which Jesus begins to tell them plainly that he's going to die, be resurrected, and ascend, right? Several times in the second half of the book, he's going to begin to say plainly. He's been talking, according to the Gospel of Mark, he's been talking in parables. He's been hinting at things. But with this declaration, thou art the Christ, he's going to start telling them plain, straight up. And when Peter hears him say, I'm going to die, I'm going to be killed by the chief priests, and I'm going to resurrect, Peter does not like this. The guy who just said, thou art the Christ. And he says, blessed are you, for flesh and blood is not revealed as you. The Spirit of God has revealed to your heart who I am. And he spoke true. He turns around and starts attacking Jesus. And Jesus looks around and says, looking at the other disciples, because they're all watching the scene, because Peter is actually furious with Jesus for saying this. Because this is not what Peter's bought into. Peter believes he's the Messiah. Peter believes he's going to topple the Romans. Peter believes he's going to take over Jerusalem. Peter believes that he's going to someday rule and reign over a kingdom as a regent king of Jesus. And he's going to have rings on his fingers and servant girls to wave palm fronds and peel grapes for him. And this thing of dying And of course, Jesus is going to say, take up your cross and follow me. And wait a minute, where do the rings come in? Where's the part about the rings? So then we come back to the question of the double healing. It's the only story in all the Gospels where Jesus had to pray for a man twice. He prays for him once, and a miracle takes place. He is given his sight, but he can't see clearly. Now, from a scientific perspective, it is very clear what's happened here. And that is that a person who's been born blind, their brain has never learned how to interpret the light signals that their eyes are sending to the brain. The brain has never received light signals. And when you're a baby and you're born, your brain has time to learn what the light signals mean, learn how to interpret them. Oh, that thing's called red. Oh, that thing's a stairwell. Oh, that thing's this. That's this. That's this. That's a person. That's a cat. That's a dog. That's a tree. But this man, he can see, but his brain has not yet begun to understand what he's seeing. A man may as well be a tree. I see them as trees walking around. I don't know what anything is. I don't know what I'm seeing. We've never known until the modern world what happens when a person born blind receives sight. Until the modern world, where we actually began to give. And it was only about 150 years ago that the first person, or maybe not even 150, maybe 100 years ago, that the first person ever received their sight from a surgery. And they were shocked when they opened their eyes. They didn't know. They would be so confused that they would sometimes get frustrated and close their eyes and start walking around with their eyes closed. Because their eyes had not yet learned how to interpret. Going up and down a flight of stairs was the most terrifying experience they ever had. Because their eye did not know how to interpret the intersecting lines and shadows. And so, on the one hand, from a physical standpoint, this is the most validatable miracle in the Bible. Psychologically, I think the resurrection is the most validatable miracle in the Bible. But from a physical perspective, this story is. So we have the story that we can look on the medical level and say, this really happened, because there's no way 2,000 years ago that somebody would understand what happens to a person that actually receives their sight when they're blind. But Jesus lets it be. He can see, but he doesn't understand what he's seeing. He can see, but he can't see clearly. So now, ask the question. In light of everything that's happening around it, the false identifications that the Pharisees are making about Jesus, warnings to the disciples about being tricked by what the Pharisees are saying about his existence, the healing of the double healing of the blind man, a conversation about the identity of Jesus and who they think he is, Peter's grand understanding that he is the Christ and that the Spirit of God has revealed this to his soul, immediately followed by Peter rebuking Jesus for saying that he's going to die. So what's the double blind healing man doing there? It's not. The question isn't whether the miracle happened. The question is, when did that miracle happen? Did it happen chronologically? Elders, boat trip, healing man, go off to have a conversation in the far north about who Jesus was? No, it's been put there for a reason. That could have happened at any particular time, but it's here, and it's here for a reason. But why? So what role could you imagine this? He sees, but he does not see clearly. Peter sees, but he does not understand that this man is a living parable for the disciples themselves. This is the kind of stuff that a history writer does. He rearranges. They don't care about. It doesn't matter when that healing took place. It matters that healing speaks powerfully and theologically to the context of the conversation about the identity of Jesus and the relationship that the disciples have to this knowledge. Because he's going to keep saying, I'm going to die. And they all sit around going, I wonder what he means by die. Since we know that he's going to rule and reign over the world, I wonder what he means by die. Maybe he's going to wish he was dead. Yeah, it must be it. Something like that. All right, so histories choose to include, exclude, and arrange data. Histories interpret cause and effect. Histories tell a story and make a point. Histories fix blame or praise on a handful of causes in an uncountable, untraceable spider's web of events, both physical and psychological. Histories are reductionistic by definition. Of all the thousands and thousands of cause and effects that are at work in this particular moment, so much so that Marxists want to claim that there's no free will because all you are is a thing in a chain of events. Just like that domino must fall when the domino before it hits it, in the same way you must make every decision that you make because of the myriad of cause and effects that have brought you to that moment. I don't believe that. So the history is reductionistic. It sweeps away all the stuff that one could argue has a place in this. Like, it does not matter for the reading of the double-blind man. A physical analysis of what happened to her has nothing to do with the role of the historian. So this is an interesting painting. So a guy once painted a picture of a pipe and wrote in the paint, "This is a pipe." So another artist took the picture of the pipe, repainted it, and wrote, "This is not a pipe." It's this. That's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. So it is a pipe, but it isn't a pipe. And so there's this thing when it comes to history, to understand that the telling of the story is not the whole. But it is intentional, it's purposeful, and you want to lock into the intention. You want to lock into the purpose. If you think by reading a history, a telling of a story, that everything has been said that should be said or could be said, then you'll be off base on that. This is the way history is. History is not the event. And we don't want to use the telling of the event to think that because of the way it's told that I can recreate the event in my imagination. The moment of inspiration, if you ask the question when dealing with a history text, where is the inspiration found? The inspiration is not found in the event. The inspiration is found in the prophetic telling of the event. The text itself is the inspired story. And so whatever you need to study to understand the telling, that is going to be your theology. That is going to be where inspiration lies. And trying to learn about the actual events that happened can give you some insight into the telling of the event. But ultimately, it's not the event, and we shouldn't be recreating. So that's just why I do a course called Meeting the Jesus of Mark. And then I want to do another one, and I've done them all, Meeting the Jesus of Luke, Meeting the Jesus of John, Meeting the Jesus of Matthew. And you say, well, if they're not the same Jesus, well, they are the same Jesus.
But they're different Jesuses to different people.
They're different presentations of Jesus. They're focusing on different aspects. If somebody knew me, did a history of me, and it was the history of my scholarship, as opposed to the history of my art, the history of my poetry, the history you could tell how many different stories you could tell about me. The history of my relationship with my hair. All right, so historicity. Historicity references the validity of events described in the historical record, their cohesion with reality. So if we want to talk about the historicity of Jesus, does the Gospel of Mark present accurate details and facts about the person of Jesus? That is a different question than talking about the theology of Matthew, the theology of Mark as they tell the story. To say, did this event happen? So they will present certain events and they will put them in different contexts because they intend for you to interpret the event in their context because they want you to gain theological insight in the way that they tell the event, where they tell the event, how they tell the event. So even though you've got the Synoptic Gospels in which you have the same stories that are told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke has their unique stories. Matthew has unique stories. I think every story in Mark appears in at least one of the other Gospels. But it's the event could be presented differently in relationship because they're not interested in chronology, they're interested in connection. How does the event relate? So if I take the story of the leper, it is told in 3 different contexts because it's 3 different narrative sermons. And they chose to include it in this sermon as opposed to that sermon. So let's take Psalm 23. So if you turn to Kenneth Bailey's book, The Good Shepherd, the 1,000-year journey from Psalm 23 to the New Testament, you're going to realize that the structure of Psalm 23 provides an interpretive paradigm in all 4 Gospels. But the place that they use the structure is different. So Matthew is going to use it in chapter 18 in Jesus' speech to the church. Mark is going to use it in the feeding of the 5,000. Right? Luke is going to connect it to the telling of the parable of the lost son and the lost coin and the lost sheep. That's where he's going to use it. And then John is going to use it in chapter 10 with Jesus' speech, I am the good shepherd. So each gospel writer has an episode dedicated to the paradigms of Psalm 23, but each one does it in a completely different place. That's just magnificent. Historicity. Did these events happen? What's beyond that? Well, what's beyond that is the message. And the message can change, and the historicity of the event can be presented In other words, I can take a single event, tell it in 3 different ways, and get a different message out of it all 3 times, but they can all still be true. The event happened, but each writer is using the event theologically in the telling of a tale. All right, so a friend of mine tells me about this woman who her husband's taking her to the bus station, and she's not paying attention, and the bus backs over and hits her. And husband grabs her up and throws her in the back seat of the car and is racing to the hospital, and he drives through an intersection, and he gets T-boned, and the woman dies. 2 different newspapers in the same town. Woman killed when hit by bus. Another one is woman killed in accident. Well, which is it? Yes. All right, so there's a difference between the events of the past, the author's account of these events, scholarly understanding of the account, and scholarly reconstruction of the events of the past. They are completely different things, and we got to make sure. So where does the inspiration lie, and where should we seek it? We should not be reading these stories to try and recast the story in our imaginations and then take our imaginative restructuring of it and find inspiration in that event. We should be reading the stories in context in order to understand what the author of the history was intending to communicate based on how he writes the book. And then conversations of the historicity take place on another level. So, for instance, the global flood. Was the flood global? There is nothing in the telling of the story in the original language that demands a global flood. So the question of whether or not it was a global flood is not going to be answered in Genesis. It's going to be answered in science as we attempt to discover whether or not there was a global flood. Now, we have evidence of sea fossils on the tops of mountains. Maybe that's evidence of the global flood. Maybe not. At that time in history, people were very cloistered to a certain region. That's their world. So if their whole world went underwater, that does not say anything about what's happening on the other side of the globe. Right. If all the scientists are right and all the continents were once one, and that they were broken up and have drifted, that could make it easier to have a global flood because it wouldn't have to be all over the whole globe. It could make it harder. It could make it, but the answer to the global is not going to be found because there's nothing in the language that demands global. There's some hints that it's pretty serious. We know scientifically that there was a massive flood in the region of the Black Sea. In fact, that the basis, the foundation of the Black Sea used to be dry ground. People lived there. Well, now it's underwater.
Cities underwater in Egypt.
Yeah. So you have the scientific question. We don't want to confuse. If the scientific investigation helps us understand the event and how the author told the event, then it's useful to us. If we think that settling the scientific questions about the story gives us the true meaning of the story, I think we are mistaken. I'm very happy that there's so many people that are writing books like the Genesis Flood and the creation work guys, the guys that, even if I disagree with them on the 7-day literal creation, not disagreeing because I think about evolution or an old earth, but simply recognizing that there's a little in the language and in the genre of Genesis, there's some wiggle room here. I still love that they do the work and they discover some amazing things about the world, and I'm very happy to have them do it. But we can't mistake the 2 tasks. They're not the same. To understand the event is to understand what the author was attempting to preach theologically, wisdom-wise, through the event. That's where inspiration is found. The event itself, our investigation into it, may add something to our understanding of that experience. It may not, but it's a different question either way, completely different question. So I am extremely conservative, theologically, very conservative. But I have to deal with my research. I have to deal with the facts that I've been working with. And what I'm seeing in the biblical creation story and in the biblical flood story is something operating on a little bit of different level than answering the scientific questions that we have to know. We just got to know. You got to tell us. I don't believe the stories were written to answer those questions. And so I think to try and force those stories to answer that question is, I think, a little bit of a mishandling of the story. All right, historicity. The capacity for a validation of historicity in biblical events may be measured on 4 levels. So we basically have, in Scripture, 4 different levels of storytelling. All right, so we have the contemporary history. It's represented in events immediately accessible to the author. I was there. My hands touched. Thomas could say, my hand. He actually didn't probably put his hands in Jesus' side, but he could have. Let's just pretend for a second that he did. Yeah, just pretend for a second he did. I don't think he did. I think he was embarrassed by the question. I think he just hung his head in shame at the very question. But let's suppose he did. He could say, my hands touched the wound in his side. I saw him die. I saw him rise. That's a certain kind of history. So they'll call that contemporary history. Previous history is represented in written accounts preserved by the authors and the predecessors. So the author of the book of Kings used sources about the past, used traditions, used annals, used all kinds of things, and then led by the Holy Spirit, crafted a history out of them, in bringing to the stories a level of arrangement and messaging that you would never get out of the events themselves. If you just saw the events, you'd see the events. It's the history writer that binds events together, stitches them together. And then you have legendary history. This is represented in the patriarchal narratives, really based on oral history, passed down. We know that oral history in oral societies is incredibly accurate because it was important to be accurate. We are sloppy because everything's written down for us. We don't burn up our energy memorizing things that are easily accessed. I had a friend who memorized his goal was to memorize the whole Bible because he was intending to go into Muslim bloc countries where he was the Bible. Yeah, he was it, a walking, talking, and that he could go in there and he could sit with them and he could recite the Bible cover to cover in English for them to then use to translate and make Bibles. So he could walk right into the country with no Bibles on him, and then all of a sudden, out of his resources, the intention was that Bibles would begin to flow because he was the Bible. Great work. But that's the kind of thing, oral history, very accurate. And then you have mythic history. This is the kind of stuff we were talking about. When I say mythic history does not mean myth. Mythic history means it's from a time period long before you even have the possibility for eyewitness testimony. Nobody was there when the Spirit of God was hovering over the deep. Adam was not even born. Adam was not made. He could not have said. He couldn't have spoken to it. He could simply, wherever the story comes from, the revelatory nature of the story through the prophets, and what we find is in this, wherever it comes from, it is a mythic type of history because it has no connection either to eyewitness testimony or to records or to anything else. Now, what we find in this, and this is basically Genesis 1 to 11, what we find there is some amazing imagery, metaphors. I don't know what things would have looked like if I were a fly on the fruit in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and I saw those events. I don't know what I would have seen. I think there's something that happened there. I think I would have seen something, whether or not it looked the way the writer tells it, whether or not, because we're working with images that have powerful meaning. This serpent, this is not a little gardener snake here. If you get the work of Michael Heiser, he makes some very interesting conversation about the nature of this serpent in his relationship to the devil, to Hasatan. Very interesting conversations. But the important thing is to understand that this serpent is the most ancient symbol of chaotic evil, the tohu vabohu, the dragons of the deep who want to bring the world back to nothingness, into chaos. They're enemies of the work of creation, first and foremost. And to weave the story together so that in the beginning, a figure who will come to be called Hasatan, but is called many names in Scripture, this cosmic evil force that resists God and seeks to tank the work of God by attacking that which he loves best, which is humanity in the world. I don't know what it would have looked like if I was there. I don't need to know what it would look like there. I'm not going to fist fight people over whether I would have seen an actual snake, whether I would have seen an actual tree. I'm not doubting, yes, it very well could have happened exactly as it has, but I can't prove it either way. I have no evidence. There's no possibility to get evidence. There's no archaeology that could discover it. Nothing. It's just not there. So to fight over it is, to me, pointless. Do I believe in literal Adam and Eve? I do. And I have good reason from the rest of Scripture to believe in a literal Adam and Eve. But what did that garden look like? What did that serpent look like? What did that tree look like? In the same way that I could describe a car accident in an apocalyptic terms of the battle of the forces of good and evil, where the tree is a beast, where the car is a dragon, where I can tell the story any way I want. So to fight over it is of no purpose to me. But I think what we do want to wrestle with is we want to wrestle with the messaging. Given the meaning that these symbols have in the ancient world, given the controlling metaphors that are in the story, and next week we're definitely going to be talking about the controlling metaphors of the story of Genesis, given what those symbols mean, maybe if I was there, I would have seen a snake in a tree, a giant snake, filled with the spirit of the demonic. Now, like I said, Michael Heiser is going to see this as a type of entity from the spirit world, from the mythic world. And that's possible. Maybe that's exactly what I'd see. But I can't fist fight over it. And I think it's foolish for us to fist fight over things that we don't have to fist fight over. What I should fist fight over is, what does this story teach me about the nature of my existence? What does this story tell me about the nature of God? What does it tell me about the nature of the human struggle? What does it tell me about the nature of the world that I live in? What does it tell me about what my mission is? What my purpose is? What kind of person I should be before God because of the messaging of the telling of the story? That is something to fist fight over. That is something to go toe-to-toe over. I'm not going to fight over something that could, given the genre of the mythic history structure, meaning, as we said, history beyond documentation, beyond eyewitness testimony, beyond archaeological discovery, beyond any proving of anything. Why would I take stances that I don't need to stand? Now, not that you wanted to follow Karl Barth, but when Karl Barth was asked about whether or not the serpent was a historical figure in terms of a real snake, Barth said, "You're missing the point. What did the serpent say? If I were there, maybe it was a snake. Maybe it was. Given the work of Michael Heiser, it's very possible that it was an actual serpent, but not of a little garter snake, of a very specific type of ancient evil, an ancient figure. Very well possible that it was. But it doesn't ultimately matter. What matters is what it is as a representative of the forces of evil and the anti-creational forces in the world, as entities that are seeking to sabotage the work of God. That's what matters. What did it say? What kind of a person am I because of what it said? What kind of a world do I live in based on what it said? That's where I really think we want to come down to. Now, and that's why you're going to say, I am super conservative in my scholarship, super conservative in my theology. This is in no way me trying to wipe away the book and try and say, oh, I'm kind of embarrassed by the story. I'm not embarrassed by the story in the least. But I do want to be a good interpreter of the story. And I am doing far more for biblical theology by paying attention to the meaning of these symbols, the clear meaning of these symbols in light of the entire mythic system of the world, the mythic imagery of the world. And like I said, this is not myth. This is prose. This is story in time. And yet, at the same time, it's so ancient, so far back, really hard to get our heads around. We're almost done. So time distance does not negate historicity, but the increase in time between events and author should be a guide in distributing a weight of investigation. I am thrilled to have people study the flood and the possibility of a global flood. Good, bad, happened, didn't happen. But in the story, it's not the be-all and the end-all of the story. The story's got a lot more going on. Do I believe there was a flood? I do, and I think we have very strong historical archaeological evidence for a massive flood right around the time period that we seem to be dealing with in the biblical story. So far, do we have evidence of a global flood? No. Doesn't bother me, though, because the story does not demand it. The story can allow it, but doesn't demand it, based on the way the story's told, based on the language. Some people will get mad at me and say that it does. And I'll say, you're reading in English. You're reading in English. All right, so we've already gone through this. Biblical historians make choices. Biblical historians make interpretations. Biblical historians tell a story, make a point. Biblical historians fic, blame, and praise. Biblical historians were prophetic figures. Biblical historians used non-biblical sources. Biblical historians use literary style. Biblical historians are more interested in meaning and significance than strict chronology and literalistic language. You cannot use the narrative to reconstruct the historical event perfectly. But you should, when you can, study the event, and it may inform something in the story. And the goal is to inform the story, because that's where inspiration lies. Everything that affects my understanding of the story, my interpretation of the story, matters. And so if historical, archaeological, linguistic studies are adding to my understanding of the story, then I'm in 100% in favor of them. But you never want to confuse that. So the primary concern is understanding the event by discerning the nuances of the author's inspired description of the event. What does the inspired author want me to understand about this event in the context of what you wrote? That's going to be all important. All right, so this is a skilled observation of the verbal portraits, details, interpreted within the characters and author's own historical realities. So here we come to the end of this lecture, 2 hours long, not quite 2 hours long. So what is Genesis? And we're going to seriously unpack this next week, but I'm going to give it right here. Genesis is a sacred narrative establishing the worldview of Israel in a carefully woven epic about Yahweh's character, plan, and work in creation, and the special role established for the children of Abraham in that plan, because of the special faith relationship between Yahweh, Abraham, and like-hearted descendants of Abraham. If you like what you're hearing today, please subscribe below, and don't forget to share it on as many platforms as you can, and tell your friends to watch. Thank you.